From the global news network of Breitbart.com, this is Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
All right, back to business on Breitbart News Daily. Tom Cotton is with me. He's senator from Arkansas, Republican. A few things to talk to you about, Senator, and thanks again, as always, for joining me. I want to talk about, for starters, the riots that are taking place throughout the United States, that it seems like any sort of legitimate protest has been totally overwhelmed by people with political motivations against this country and against our small business owners, et cetera, looking to divide us. Give us your 30,000-foot perspective, and then I'm going to ask you a couple specifics on how to quell some of this.
So Alex, first off, I want to say that, like all of your listeners, I was deeply disturbed by the video we saw of George Floyd's death, and I commend the local authorities and the Department of Justice for promptly investigating the matter and seeking to do justice in accordance with law. I wouldn't paint with such a broad brush to say that there are no more peaceful protests. I mean, obviously, it's a big country and not everything gets covered in the news. I have no doubt that there remain some peaceful protests across the country, and we respect the right of peaceful protests. However, there can be no doubt, based on the images we see on television, especially during hours of darkness, that infiltrators and agitators, anarchists and insurrectionists have hijacked these protests and used them as an opportunity to riot and loot and wreak rampant carnage across the streets of America. And for that, we can have zero tolerance.
Yeah, and I think I said that the protests have been overwhelmed. There certainly are peaceful people. In fact, some of them almost comically so. I think I saw a massive yoga session going on in front of the LA mayor's house. So absolutely peaceful in certain areas. But it does seem like the in a broader sense, the focus now has become the rioting and what to do about it. And you're someone who has been proactive in suggesting things that are out of the ordinary, but are perhaps necessary, perhaps using some of our airborne divisions, immediate response forces. You're a pro in this regard. You're a veteran yourself. Talk to us about what are our options.
The only way to meet these rioters and looters, anarchists, and insurrectionists is with an overwhelming display of force. And the very reason an overwhelming display of force is necessary is to eliminate the need to employ force. You've seen that in the last couple of nights in the streets of Washington, D.C. The Attorney General has said, with thousands of specialized law enforcement agencies and the National Guard available, there's been a dramatic decline in violent incidents, destruction of property, or attacks on innocent life. You've seen it as well in Minneapolis once the governor there finally called out the full National Guard to protect the Twin Cities area. There's been a decline in violence as well. This is not a surprise. This is exactly what you have to do to deal with these kind of insurrectionists and anarchists. Unfortunately, you have other cities like New York City, run by perhaps the most clueless politician in America, that refuses to even use the National Guard, something for which the governor of New York State criticized him for yesterday. And what do we see in New York City? The violence continues to get worse. Now, in these cities where the local law enforcement are overwhelmed by the numbers of anarchists and insurrectionists on the street, and that potentially even the National Guard can't supply adequate numbers across the entire state, then there is a long-standing solution, nearly as old as our republic, known as the Insurrection Act. It allows the president to federalize the National Guard or to call forth active duty military troops to support local law enforcement. It has been done repeatedly throughout our history, most recently in 1992 in the LA riots, or throughout the 1950s and the 1960s to deal with racist mobs or to deal with rioting and looting. That's exactly what happened in my own state in 1957 when President Eisenhower responded to a racist Democrat, Orville Faubus, who was using our National Guard to prevent desegregation of Little Rock Central. Eisenhower federalized the National Guard, and he sent in the 101st Airborne. I suspect that people like Bill de Blasio think that was a good use of federal authority, and that if necessary, that's exactly what we should do to put down the mobs on our streets today.
There's so much there to unpack. Let's start with New York, where the governor, Cuomo, and the mayor of New York City, de Blasio, are actually sparring with one another in this regard. The fact that de Blasio does not want the National Guard deployed. And you see stuff like de Blasio's own daughter getting arrested during the protest, and he praised her for it. He actually said it was a good thing. So you've got a mayor openly praising some of the protests. And again, Senator, we don't object to the peaceful protests. If that's how people want to grieve over the death of George Floyd, which seems heinous, then absolutely. But that is not the issue here in New York. What's the issue now is that you're seeing some of these stores, Macy's Signature Store, getting ramshackled. And that needs to be dealt with. And the mayor seems to be standing in the way of that. Do you think there's a logic to his position on this?
No, it's just a radical left-wing ideology. Look, Bill de Blasio ran against the New York Police Department in 2013, and he has been at loggerheads with the brave men and women of the NYPD ever since. And now he criticizes them for trying to defend themselves, much less trying to defend the innocent civilians in their lives and their livelihoods in New York City. And he refuses to call forward the National Guard troops that are there, ready and available. National Guard troops are often standing in Penn Station if you take a train in and out of New York City. When the New York City Police Department need that exact kind of support, when even Andrew Cuomo, the liberal Democrat who runs New York State, says that it's necessary as well. The tenure of Bill de Blasio of New York City, even before this pandemic and these riots, was terrible, but now it's going to go down as an absolute disaster.
Yeah, I think so too. And when you see the left freaking out over him, then you know that other elements of the left, and you know he's really gone too far. But we're seeing things in D.C. which improved immeasurably from over the last two nights since the president became more vocal. And you saw this a relatively extreme show of force with the chairman of Joint Chiefs and the defense secretary, Mark Esper, Mark Milley, the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, walking the streets of the United States, sometimes in full military regalia, as the president activated troops. This had a look that was probably unfamiliar to a lot of Americans, but it had an effect of really shutting down most of the protests or most of the riots.
Yeah, so in Washington, D.C. on Sunday night, there was significant violence in and around the White House. St. John's Church, where every president has worshiped since James Madison, was set on fire. Dozens of businesses were attacked and looted. The president and the attorney general resolved that would not happen again. So on Monday night, they had thousands of specialized law enforcement agencies as well as the National Guard on the street. And last night there was even more. And again, not surprisingly, there was virtually no violence. There were large protests in violation of the mayor's curfew, but there was no significant violence on the streets of Washington, D.C. Now, Alex, Washington, D.C. is something of a special case. It's our nation's capital. It's a federal enclave. It is the headquarters of so many very highly specialized law enforcement agencies like the Secret Service and like the Park Police. Therefore, they have numbers and capabilities to bring to bear to restore order that most cities do not. That's why most cities and most rely on their National Guard, because you can't simply replicate what happened in Washington, D.C. over the last two nights in every other city that doesn't have a large Secret Service contingent, that doesn't have a large Park Police contingent. Therefore, you have to rely on the National Guard if local law enforcement is overwhelmed. And if necessary, as a last resort, the Insurrection Act does allow federal troops to backstop and support the local law enforcement and the National Guard.
Absolutely, and I want to go there momentarily, but there was something interesting because the president requested that the Virginia governor, Ralph Northam, send the National Guard, and he refused. Do you have any sense of why he would do that or what his thinking was?
I don't. I'm not aware of significant violence in Virginia that would have required him to keep his own National Guard in total reserve. So I suspect it was just blind partisan opposition, that he didn't want to send troops into what he viewed as Donald Trump's Washington or some other symptom of Trump derangement syndrome, which he and so many other Democratic governors seem to suffer.
Yeah, that was my guess as well. Again, we're not going to be able to read his mind. I think he's a pretty poor governor. Full disclosure, I'm a Northern Virginia resident. I live just across the way from the Potomac, and he's disappointing at in every sense. But it does seem like there's relative peace in my neck of the woods, and just across the river, it's not. There are stores getting beat in by these rioters, and he does not want to help. So I'm guessing it's a partisan thing as well. So let's talk a little bit more about the Insurrection Act, which you brought up. And this is something that we've discussed it on the show a couple of times earlier this week. Walk us through exactly what it is and how you deploy it.
Yeah, so the Insurrection Act, as I said, is almost as old as our republic. It goes back to 1807. And it says simply the president, if he gets a request from the governors of a state, which is consistent with the constitutional responsibility to put down domestic insurrections of our national government, or if he views it that the laws are not being enforced or local law enforcement is overwhelmed, he can issue his own proclamation to insurrectionists to stand down, and if they don't, then call forth the federal troops. Again, it's literally been used dozens of times throughout our history, most recently by George H.W. Bush in 1992. To help quell the L.A. riots. But again, it was used repeatedly in the 50s and the 60s to stop racist mobs from preventing desegregation or ransacking some of our biggest cities. In 1957 in Arkansas, in 1962 in Mississippi, in 1963 in Alabama, in 1967 in Detroit, in 1968 in Washington, in Baltimore, in Chicago. Any of these left-wing reporters or politicians who think this is somehow unprecedented or the verge of authoritarianism are deeply historically illiterate.
Again, Senator Tom Cotton's my guest, Republican from Arkansas. And I think that the polls that we've seen have suggested that most of the citizens are open-minded to this because they see law and order deteriorating before our eyes and they would like it restored. This is not a left or right value. It's an American value of law and order. It was something that virtually everyone in society at least claims to want, Senator. And so I think the people are with you. I think the media, though, is harshly opposed to this. And you can see it in some of the headlines. I'm looking at a headline right now from the far left independent newspapers, comes out of the UK, which is talking about one of your appearances recently on Fox News, where it says you want to unleash the army on protesters. Is that an accurate characterization of what you're calling for, Senator?
No, hardly. Again, the point of having the National Guard and, if necessary, active duty federal troops on site is so you have an overwhelming display of force, which will eliminate the need to employ force against violent anarchists. That's what we saw in Washington, D.C. last night. When you have the National Guard guarding some of our most sacred memorials to our honored war dead, those violent anarchists, guess what? They don't go up to it and start desecrating it. When they're guarding churches and businesses, those churches don't get set on fire and they don't get looted. That's the whole point of having an overwhelming display of force, so you don't have to employ force in the first place. And ultimately, these insurrectionists get the picture and disperse.
And by the way, I think that's why we talked about Virginia a moment ago. I think that's why there's relative peace in Virginia. Virginia actually has the Second Amendment, unlike in Washington, D.C., which somehow it doesn't have it. And so if you're a rioter, where are you going to go? You're going to go to the softer targets. You're going to go to a place where people are not going to shoot back, and you're going to go to a place where the mayor is commending the rioters.
Yeah, but look, Alex, you talk about the media. They have not exactly covered themselves in glory over the last 2 months. So on the one hand, any person who shows up at a protest so they can get back to their normal kind of life and start their livelihood again is considered an outlaw that should be thrown in jail. A woman who wants to open her hair salon so she can make a living and provide a living for her stylists should be jailed and fined. However, violent insurrectionists that are burning our cities should be celebrated, and under no conditions should law enforcement be used against them. That's the position now that a lot of the media and a lot of these Democratic politicians have taken, which is absurd.
Do you believe opening the country up would help quell some of this? Do you believe it would lessen some of the rioting?
Well, I guess we're going to see, because I don't see how a place like New York City or some of these other Democratic-run cities and states can now go back and say that we're going to keep our people under lockdown when they've been tolerating and even celebrating, mass riots and looters, by the thousands, who, suffice to say, are not exactly social distancing. If you're not going to arrest people for breaking into a business, how are you going to arrest people for opening a business?
Yeah, very good point. There's something darkly humorous yesterday where it was a big day for corporations to virtue signal. I think a lot of it was kind of mild, to be honest. I mean, they're signifying that they're with the protesters. But there's something about it to me that was darkly funny, because a lot of these businesses do business with China, and China is openly racist towards black people. They've banned black people from restaurants. They censor black people out of their movie posters, and they're basically trying to colonize Africa with their Belt and Road Initiative. And all these businesses now, but they're very woke on what's going on right now throughout the United States. You're one of the most knowledgeable and sharp people on China in our Senate. Do you have any reaction to what I just laid out?
Yeah, well, it didn't stop any of these woke companies from getting looted on Rodeo Drive or in Buckhead Mall or any of the other places where these looters specifically targeted high-end luxury brands who have been virtue signaling for so long. So in the end, you can try to placate the mob as much as you want, but when the mob comes, it's not going to distinguish between the woke liberals and just ordinary Americans who want to earn a living.
Yeah, if anything, it seems like the fashion world is almost entirely left wing. I mean, I joke sometimes that if you try to dress yourself with only a right of center clothing brands, I mean, you'd basically be walking around naked all day. I mean, there's just almost no way to do it. And it's Nike in particular putting out all these woke commercials, and they, of LeBron James and Colin Kaepernick and some of the biggest they would think of themselves as civil rights activists. They're getting looted every day. As a new Nike store getting looted. So it's not working in terms of convincing people that they shouldn't loot your business if that's the goal. So I don't know what the goal is overall, other than to broadcast a signal to the world. But let's talk about, is there anything that can be done to heal? Is there anything that we can do? Because a lot of people are sitting at home thinking, well, where do we go next from here? This is such a dark moment, at least the way the media is portraying it. What do we do, Senator?
Well, the first thing we have to do is to put down the mobs. We cannot have a civil, reasoned discourse about any of the issues that protesters want to raise or that divide our political parties or our citizens among ourselves, while there are mobs in our streets trying to burn down our cities, destroying livelihoods, and in some cases taking lives. That's the absolute essential, is to stop the mob violence. Now, in terms of what's precipitated all this, the death of George Floyd last week, as I said, that video is horrible, and it's hard to think of what could justify the use of force by the police officer who kept his knee on George Floyd's neck for almost 10 minutes. And that's why I say it's a good thing that the local authorities and the Department of Justice have moved so promptly to get the facts and to do justice for Mr. Floyd and his family in accordance with the rule of law. It may be that the Minneapolis Police Department has some problems with the way they train and the way they employ force. I have to note that this is not the first time in recent years in which citizens in Minneapolis have died or been injured by a Minneapolis police officer. So the governor there announced that they would review Minneapolis policing practices. We should get all the facts, and if there are corrective actions that need to be taken, we should take them. We shouldn't paint with a broad brush, though, and label every police officer in this country racist, or say that they're somehow anti-American, or that the violence that is sometimes needed to meet criminal violence is never justified. That is something I'm not willing to do, and I don't think most normal, sensible Americans are willing to do either.
Well said. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican, Arkansas. Thanks so much again for joining me on Breitbart News Daily today.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.